Hello, welcome to my new channel. I decided to create a brand new one just for Valorant talk because my old one's full of all messy stuff from all over the place and is really just more suited to being a variety channel anyway. So this is where you come for the nitty gritty, the Valorant talk, and what a topic to begin with, man. The guard not making it into Ascension is just boggles the mind. So let's get into it. There's been a lot of community outrage about the guard not making it into Ascension, and I think for very good reason. But a lot of the community outrage, I think, kind of misses the point a little bit, which is weird to say because I actually agree with a huge amount of it. But a lot of it comes from an idealistic point of view, and I'm not an idealist, I'm a pragmatist. I like to try and solve situations in a way that makes sense for the real world, right? And the idealistic point of view is you want the players to win. You want the players to be in the league no matter what. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Actually, it's the most pragmatic solution as well, as we'll talk about later on too. But most of the arguments that people are making, the fans, etc., are a little bit nonsensical within this system that exists because they ignore how the system works. The system currently of Ascension is designed to set up the org to ascend, not necessarily the players. And that means that, as recent reports have said, even if the guard themselves had ascended, there is all the likelihood in the world that it wouldn't have actually been this roster, because economical reasons mean that the organization wouldn't have probably been able to hold on to those players. So they would have ended up being scattered to the winds anyway. Now, if you disagree with the fact that Ascension, builds up the organization into the partnered system anyway, that's a completely different discussion, and it's just totally different. There are very few protections for players. The community doesn't seem to, the community seems to have invented a 3 out of 5 roster rule, which I can't find any evidence for. I don't think it actually exists. And we will definitely, even though we didn't in this exact situation, we will definitely at some point have a scenario in which an org ascends and can't keep hold of their roster because they just can't commit to tier 1 salaries that their players are then going to command by virtue of proving themselves as winning players that have a serious chance in a partnership system. I've seen some people try to answer this with, just mandate that the org keeps the players, but you can't require that an organization keeps these players on their roster once they ascend, because then the players can demand ridiculously outsized salaries. And then if the organization doesn't pay, they lose their spot. That's too much power for the players to have, the control of whether or not an organization entirely is in or out of the partnership system. And even if you didn't agree that it's too much power for the players, even if you wanted that power to be in the players' hands, you'll just end up in these situations more often where the organization refuses to pay what the players are asking because it's ridiculous. And then you have another team that's failed to ascend and won't sign the TPA. So, in summary, if you hate this system and you think that it should be the roster that holds the spot and not the organization, you're just going to have to back out of this video, and maybe we'll do another video about that another time because it's a completely different discussion. And there are so many problems with a roster holding the spot that I just wouldn't even be able to get to in this video because it's about a different thing. So, having said that, if you accept the premise that the system as we live in currently promotes the organization and not the roster, then there should still be systems in place to deal with this scenario, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So how did we even get to this point? Let's bring up the announcement, which was just boom, bombshell, dropped on the scene. After several months and rounds of communication with the guard, the organization has failed to meet the deadline to agree to the TPA for VCT Americas. As a result, the guard will not be participating in the 2024 VCT Americas League. And crucially, no team will be promoted to VCT Americas, and the league will field 10 teams for the upcoming season. So, to set the scene a little bit, the guard applied for partnerships in 2022, or whenever the hell that was. Must have been 2022, I can't even remember. All the years are blended into one now. But they didn't sign the TPA in 2023 after they got into the partnership system. So what the hell changed in the meantime? A few things. Esports winter. The guard started pulling back in terms of their esports spending in general, and we actually don't know what was involved in the TPA. It's probably, in fact, it definitely is a different TPA compared to the ones that the partnership teams are signing. I mean, for starters, we know that it's different because it's not a permanent spot in the partnership system. They're only in there for 2 years, but there are also differences as well that we'll get to. But let's start here. What is a team participation agreement? What does that even mean? What is a TPA? So it's an agreement that the organizations sign with Riot to agree to participate by the rules in which Riot puts forth to be in partnerships. If you don't sign, you're outside the system and you can't participate. I think we can all agree that there needs to be some legal framework in place for for a league like this to run, right? You couldn't possibly do it without there being some rules in place. So you need TPAs. And these are going to define your responsibilities as an organization and the benefits that you get from being part of the partnership system. So that means stuff like minimum salary is going to be part of the TPA. Your digital goods, which skins you get, what percentage of the revenue you get, that kind of thing. The stipend that Riot's talked about teams getting. The requirements to get said stipend, which are not public at the moment, but some orgs have alluded to the fact that they exist and have to do with, various things like promoting certain events and running other events yourself, etc., etc. Probably some content requirements and stuff in there as well. But none of it particularly public. And Leo said in this announcement, which we will get to in just a moment, here, this is the part that I want to focus on right now. Teams competing in challenges knew that what they were playing for since the start of the season. Every team that qualified for Ascension signed the team participation agreement prior to the start of the tournament, and signatures were held in escrow. So what this means is that the teams have looked through the partnerships agreements, they've signed it at the beginning, but they're held in you can think of it as being held in some security vault somewhere. And it's only upon releasing it from the security vault that it actually becomes valid. You sign it at the beginning just for it to be held there. Obviously, not all of the team partnership agreements could be valid at the start of Ascension because you don't know who's going to win it. Riot haven't agreed for all of those teams to participate. So there needs to be some system by which they are null and voided once you are eliminated from the tournament, right? And this is the system that they have. So let's lay out some of the guards' responsibilities. We're going to hit on this tweet from Leo later on, but let's talk about the guards' responsibilities because not many people are really discussing that. So what is the guard responsible for? So they're responsible for, fielding a roster for Ascension and that kind of thing if they want to participate. And then they've got to read the team participation agreement. They've got to read the TPA. They've got to make a decision on whether they want to sign the TPA or not. And if they're planning to leave esports entirely, which it looks like they are right now, it looks like the Cronky group is gearing up to completely abandon the investment in esports. If that's the case, you need to release the team as free agents or let Riot know that they intend to not sign the TPA at the very least, right? You need to have some indication that you're not going to sign this, that your team is free to do whatever they like before the deadline. Did they know that there was a deadline? That's what's difficult to tell from the tweets that Leo's put out. Clearly, the team participation agreement was available for them to read, and clearly they could have made a decision internally within the organization about whether or not they were planning to sign the TPA or not, whether they wanted to participate. But it's possible they might not have known when the deadline is. I would assume that would be part of the TPA, though. I would assume that would have been communicated. And if so, that is their responsibility to get their ducks in a row and make sure that they don't fuck their team over. That is a responsibility that you have to these young players. But there is a middle ground here. There is a middle ground between signing the TPA and not signing the TPA. And that might seem weird because it does seem like a dichotomy. But there might have been some room for negotiation. This is the first time that teams are ascending. And we don't know the exact details of the team participation agreement. So it's possible that these teams might have wanted to change some of the terms in the TPA. And you don't have any leverage to do that when they're first handed to you at the start of Ascension. But you do have some leverage to do that once you've won Ascension. Because Riot presumably don't want a shit show where you don't sign the TPA and then they have to go through all of this bollocks that we're currently experiencing. We are living the bollocks right now, right? So in theory, there's a bit of leverage there to try and get some terms adjusted. If you end up overplaying your hand, maybe you end up in a situation like this. One of the other things, though, that the Guard could have done, which they don't appear to have done, is use the public forums or use journalistic outlets to apply some pressure And that's done very frequently in situations like this. You know, you leak some term of the TPA that you don't like to a journalist, and the journalist thinks that it's important information to get out there to the world, as it really would be. And then that ends up putting pressure on Riot, and Riot maybe end up bending a little bit. And, you know, that's a really common way that the public press is used to influence these kind of situations. And one of the reasons why, when you're a journalist, you have to be really careful about what people leaking stuff to you are trying to get out of the situation. Certainly something that I experienced while I was doing journalistic work in Overwatch. And also, finally, to get back on topic rather than this tangent, the Guard have a responsibility of keeping their players informed at all parts of the process, which they absolutely failed to do. And some of these tweets from, like, Net and Jonah P were, I mean, they're heartbreaking. These guys found out on fucking Twitter that they weren't going to be, not just that they weren't going to be in the league, but that their organization wasn't going to be in the league, that there was going to be 5 left spots for them to even ascend as players, that they certainly weren't going to be able to ascend as a full team, which may have been their dream, although perhaps the reality kicked in a little earlier than that, as reports are now currently saying. So let's talk about why Guard wouldn't want to sign the TPA. So Cronkies want out of esports. We've already talked about that. But also the TPA may end up being a little unfavorable. So previously, when I've gone through some of the videos like this in the past on my other channel, we've said that all of the wording has used phrases like the ascending teams will have similar what's the word that they use? Like similar terms or similar rewards, similar benefits to the partnership teams. And when pressed, the Riot senior management have come out and said that similar was only used because they're not permanent, right? They specifically said that they are treated exactly the same, except that they are not permanent partners. And this is false, as we now know, based on Leo's follow-up tweet. Something that I talked about extensively on Plat Chat, and I'm sure if you watch that rant, you'll be bored of me pointing it out. But these parentheses are way more important than just a single throwaway phrase in this tweet, because they explain that inside the TPA, there would be an exception, there would be a major difference between the partnership team's TPA and the ascending team's TPA. The Ascension teams would not have a team-branded gun skin. And what that means is that you are not going to have anywhere near the same revenue in terms of your digital goods sales. And it's possible that there would be some kind of make good within the TPA, but I doubt that because you have no way of knowing how much a team-branded gun skin would be able to sell. So I don't see how they would be able to get ahead of that. Now, there are probably minimums in there for teams that don't sell, barely any skins. There's probably a minimum in there as like, we'll make up to however many hundreds of thousands if you fail to sell a huge amount of skins, so that even if you're unpopular, you still get some support. But that's not as good as actually having the opportunity to capitalize on your fan base, which is how esports essentially works, right? And also, there are rumors of there being higher requirements for access to the stipend compared to the partner teams. But again, we have so little info here when it comes to the TPA that it's pretty impossible to speculate accurately at all. And I said it on Plat Chat, I'll say it here again. I think the TPA is the kind of document that has a lot of benefit being leaked to journalists in the scene, because the differences between, well, let's put it like this, right? Let's go back to the full screen webcam to make this point. So what we know from Leo's tweet again is that the teams were given these TPAs at the start of Ascension. So that means that they didn't know, presumably before Ascension, how all of this was going to work. That's extremely, extremely late in the Tier 2 calendar. And I think it was Arden that was talking about this on the podcast, where he was saying, give me just a moment here. Yeah, so Arden was saying that that's incredibly late in order to figure that out. And the entire system is fairly shrouded in mystery. Now, if you're participating in Tier 2, you're not in any way on like an inside loop. the tier 2 teams, the challengers teams, a lot of them are fairly amateurish or smaller organizations. They're not talking to Riot all the time, as far as I'm aware. And especially with the Premier system now looping into challengers, that there isn't really a proper way of disseminating this information widespread to the tier 2 circuit in a private way. So I personally think that TPAs like this for the tier 2 scene, as they go into tier 1, are actually really important to be public, because they inform whether or not people want to invest in the tier 2 scene. If you're like, I know that Ludwig has been really active on this topic because he literally co-owns one of the teams in tier 2 Valorant. Did he know that the details of the TPA? Probably not. I mean, does anybody outside of Ascension know the details of the TPA? I'm not sure that they do. Perhaps. But I think there's a lot of mystery at work here. And if you do only find out at Ascension, it's way too late and way too few people that know the details of what benefits you're actually going to get. How can anyone make an effective return on investment decision when they don't know what the returns are going to be on their investment? If you don't know the details of the TPA, you don't want to know what the returns are. So, we've talked quite a bit about the Guard and the TPA. Let's talk about Riot and their responsibilities. Riot have a responsibility to have systems in place to make sure that shit shows like this don't happen, right? They're responsible as the developer and as the tournament organizer to make sure that they have contingency plans if things go wrong, and have a rule set that's thorough, precise, etc., etc. And if you want to talk about that in VCT in general, they've actually done a good job of building out those processes. A couple of years ago, those processes were terrible. They were absolutely shite. We had awful rulings over and over again at large tournaments. We haven't had one of those for a while, and having spoken to the people behind the comp ops now, their systems are much more rigorous. So Riot have a responsibility to have good systems in place and build out good precedents as well. And that's something that Leo talks about quite a lot during this statement that he made, which is, you know, as painful as it is to make this decision, we have a responsibility to protect the integrity of the sport, trying to do what's best for the long term, and trying not to set poor precedents as well. He mentions questionable precedents quite a number of times during the course of this tweet, like twit longer, essentially, I guess. And this is still year one, so I think it's reasonable to give them a little bit of slack. They're actually doing a pretty good job as a developer in terms of like building out these systems in general. It's a very good system that they have. It's just that this exact situation is the worst decision that I've seen from Riot. And there have been plenty of quite poor to fairly bad decisions. I mean, the turret bug being one of them that I massively disagreed with, of course. But this is bigger than the turret bug, right? And it's a very poor decision, in my opinion. So whilst most of the time I feel like the decisions that Riot makes are based in some logic, even if you disagree with the fact that, for example, organizations should hold the spot, if you accept the premise that orgs should hold the spot, things tend to follow logically on from that and are fairly well built out and thorough. However, this is one of those situations where the logic doesn't make sense, the decision is terrible, it's all round just a very bad decision. So they announced that there's going to be 10 teams for Americas. That means that there's going to be, well, yeah, I suppose let's go to this. Why is it such a bad decision, right? Why is this such a terrible decision, this announcement? It means that there's going to be a different amount of Americas teams compared to all of the other leagues. That means there's going to be format problems for 2024 and onwards, because this is going to ripple down into the future. This means that there's no organization involved in Americas from Ascension, but also no players, right? The Guard players also get fucked. I mean, they're the main people who get fucked, actually. But it also removes 5 spots. Even if the Guard were planning to ascend and not bring any of the Guard players, at least there'd be 5 slots for some people to get paid. At least there would be jobs being created. This is like the Players Association actually said for Valorant in Americas. This is taking jobs away actively from pro players. And I think the biggest reason why it sucks as a decision is it just ruins trust in the Tier 2 system. It is directly going to drive away investment at a time when content creators like Ludwig, like Disguised Toast, like Moist Critical are actively trying to get into the scene? You know, there is a groundswell of grassroots support, if you want to call it grassroots support. I suppose they are just kind of rich people looking to get in, but they're rich people made through streaming culture and gaming, so it feels different. It is different. And you're ruining that trust that they are starting to have in your product. So that's one of the biggest reasons why I think it's a terrible idea. On top of the fact that it ruins competitive integrity for the 2024 partnership system, because you just then going to have like different formats for Americas and everywhere else, so that'll, again, have cascading consequences. So now let's dig into the meat and potatoes of Leo's. By the way, fuck this statement from the guard. I don't understand how you possibly arrive at the outcome unexpectedly, but I don't even know whether to believe this. I don't know who wrote this. I don't know how many people are even working at the guard. It might have been ChatGPT for all I know. So let's work through this statement from Leo, shall we? I'm not going to read it all, but I want to start with a really important point, which is in this paragraph. With the way that our Path to Pro is designed, it's fair to assume that a free agent team might eventually get to challenges and even win Ascension. Yeah, I think that is fair to assume, especially with the integration that they now have with Premier. We want to see 5 friends and a dream make it all the way to the top, and we're prepared for that occasion. We are prepared. Okay. In case a free agent team makes it to an international league, the players would have an opportunity to find an organization that would support them in the international league. So let's just focus on this part for a moment. Leo's saying that they are prepared for free agent teams and that they would have opportunities to find an org that would support them in the international league. And from stuff that has now been talked about publicly from Bonkers, the like free agent team that played in APAC Ascension, they would have had 2 months, they said, to be able to find an organization to support them in the international league. But they had to find an organization, again, because the org... all right, let's start here. So the spot must be held by a single corporate entity rather than a collection of players. I think this is sensible. Like I said at the beginning of this video, if you don't think that's sensible, it's a completely different discussion, right? But there are good reasons to do that so that you don't have to worry about, you know, which of the players actually holds the spot. You don't have to worry about what happens if they need to make roster changes or if people retire and then you don't have that roster carrying on for the full 2 years or however long, you know, you would be ascended for. So I think it's very sensible, the fact that they require a corporate entity, like a single entity, to hold the spot. And Bonkers only seems to have discovered this during Ascension. Again, as to Alton's point on Platchat that I talked about earlier, I think that's too late. I think that's too shrouded in mystery. I think that should have been public information because it's too difficult to disseminate that info throughout the Tier 2 scene because it's too large and too amateurish. But let's assume that's true. Let's assume all the teams knew that. You have 2 months to find an org. What does that process look like? Because the players have a ton of power in that situation. How many of the players do you have to keep on the roster? Is it just 1? Is it all 5? Is it 3 out of 5, as is the case in some other games like previously in Counter-Strike? I'm not sure if that's the same rule in CS anymore for like legend spots carrying over or whatever. I think the most likely outcome is that you are, let's say, for sake of an argument, you're required to keep some of the players. Not all 5, but some of the players. What that's going to do is introduce a massive bidding war. Now, I think it would make sense for that to be a 3 out of 5, because if it's a 2 out of 5, 2 parts of the team could both claim the spot. So it can't be, it wouldn't make sense for it to be 2 or less, right? Because otherwise, team splits in half, suddenly, which half is the real half? Which half deserves the spot? So it would have to be 3, 4, or 5 of the roster that you were required to pick up, yeah? So if we accept that assumption, I think there's going to be a bidding war then from Riot-approved organizations. So first of all, the organizations would have to be Riot-approved beforehand, before they start bidding on this team. But essentially, that's just going to be a bidding war, which is literally buying a spot, right? So Leo's talked about how they don't want, I mean, he talks here about opening the door for slots in VCT to be sold, which we do not allow. How could you possibly create a system where 5 friends in a dream get picked up by an organization and it doesn't become a bidding war? How would you possibly have that occur? If it wasn't a system, right, let's try and think of a system where it's not, I hate to say free market here because it would only be Riot-approved organizations allowed to bid on the roster anyway, right? But if it wasn't a system powered by the Riot-approved market, if it was, like MCE was suggesting on Plat Chat, a lottery system, right? So you have a bunch of organizations and they all have an equal chance of representing this org. And they do some kind of, lottery system, and ta-da, it's TSM, or ta-da, it's Moist Moguls, or whatever the fuck. How do you decide the salaries? As far as I'm aware, any attempt to regulate those salaries, whether you used the median salary for the league, or whether you used a Riot preordained budget that was like, instead of all of the players having the median salary, you use the median budget, and they could, alter people's salaries at the discretion of the organization afterwards. Whatever system you use to try and set the salaries there for the lottery system, I think it would come under antitrust laws. I don't think you're allowed to do that. As far as I'm aware, that would be illegal because there's no collective bargaining agreement from the players. And if you are thinking as a counterpoint, well, run the lottery. Whoever wins the lottery gets to decide how much to pay the players. Guys, again, the players could just decide to ask for $1 million each. And then if the org says no, you're back to square one with another team that doesn't want to, sign the TPA and sign the players. So unless you have a market-regulated salary system, I don't see how it works. And if it is a market-regulated salary system, that's a bidding war. That's buying a slot, literally, from these free agent players. That is buying a free agent team who already come with a slot, therefore buying a slot. So I don't understand how this free agent system would work, and I'd love to learn more about it, but I would speculate it doesn't exactly function as neatly as they would want us to believe. So here's the other thing, though. For the free agent team, the reason why the players wouldn't have all the power in the world and wouldn't be able to demand $1 million each necessarily, if it was a free market system, is because they would need an approved organization by the deadline, right? So there's a time pressure. They can't just say no to everybody and keep driving the price up because there's a 2-month deadline. So they've got to get it by the 2-month deadline. And so, there's a bit of chicken being played there, but the players would want to participate. The orgs would want to participate. You don't get this kind of system where one of the people involved just doesn't want to be involved. But this could happen a different way. So the current situation that we have of the guard not signing the TPA, that could also happen in another way. What if Riot denied the organization that won? What if you had an organization that clashed with their regulations around betting, for example, or their regulations around, pornography, or their regulations around, maybe it's a content creator that's had a heinous past. What if, Andrew Tate or whatever decides to fund a team and they win Ascension, and Riot decides that they're not approved. Now, Bodork has talked about the fact that there is a lowered approval system, like a less stringent approval system. But it is definitely possible that an organization could win Ascension and Riot would not want them involved. What would happen if Riot rejects a team during that approvals process? It seems like you would be in the exact same position that you are right now. And if Riot don't have contingencies for that scenario, then they're not going to have contingencies for this scenario either. They are the same scenario. If the guard was rejected, if they weren't allowed to sign the TPA, we'd be in this exact same spot. So this is not just a failure of one contingency plan. This is actually a failure, it seems, of 2. And specifically, things would get even weirder if the players were under contract, right? So let's say fictional universe, we have let's use Andrew Tate, for example, because he was already involved in the like G2 fiasco, but it's like really much more severe if it was his entire org. Yeah. So let's say Tate Esports wins Ascension and the players are all under contract. They're not free agents. Well, what happens then? You can't just treat the team as if they were free agents because they're still under contract. There would be a buyout. The team that you have declined would benefit, and it would be essentially selling the spot. There would be money that changes hands from whoever Riot approves to take over. They would have to pay money to Tate Esports to pick up the roster. Would that mean that the next org up gets in? And can the orgs even get pre-approved so that they know whether or not to participate? Certainly, I don't think that every organization in Tier 2 has gone through a Riot approvals process already. Certainly, not every player in Tier 2 has gone through a Riot approvals process already. I would find it extremely unlikely that the players in the Union, for example, who had a very good shot of winning Ascension, I don't think all of their players would have been permitted to participate in the partnership system based on what they've done in the past. I might be wrong there. That is just me speculating. I don't speak on behalf of Riot, but I would be very surprised if they were allowed to participate. So, based on the fact that they've like groomed people and assaulted their partners and been, charged with that as well. So, I'd be very surprised if all of the players are pre-approved and the organizations, but you kind of need that system in place. If the Tier 2 orgs don't know whether or not they're going to be approved if they win Ascension, what's the reason to participate? So let's finally get to the... I feel like we've been going on a long time without even talking. We've been talking for half an hour now without even talking about the 3 options that Leo highlighted here. But I'd like to go through them now, and a lot of them we've already kind of covered the reasons why I like them or don't like them. So this first... So Leo says, to address this particular situation, we considered 3 different options. 1, allow these 5 players to be picked up by a new organization. 2, promote the Ascension runner-up. Or 3, not promote any team. Can't believe they ended up on 3, but there we go. So why didn't they go for number 1? Allow these 5 players to be picked up by a new organization. Well, Leo says this particular situation is different compared to them just being a free agent team entirely, since this team played through a Challengers and Ascension under the Guard banner and became free agents after the fact. Now, I actually asked one of the Guard players, and they only became free agents, like 4 out of 5 of them only became free agents on the 1st of September when I'm recording this video. So they were certainly not, free agents when the TPA deadline was hit, which I can imagine is a major roadblock to being considered for this first option, right? If the players are not free agents, which I think a lot of the community were assuming, I was assuming this as well until I asked one of the players of the Guard, I was assuming that they were free agents when the TPA deadline was happening, but they weren't. They were under contract with the Guard. And they became free agents after the TPA deadline had passed. So Riot are saying allowing an acquisition by a different organization now opens the door for slots in the VCT to be sold, which we do not allow. I don't understand this for a couple of reasons. So the most obvious way of reading this statement is that if you are an org, let's say M80, they're annoyed that they didn't win Ascension, and they're like, shit, they get in a room with the owner of the Guard. They get in a room with the Guard from the Guard. And they're like, dude, Mr. Guard, I am willing to pay you to decline the TPA. And I'll pick up your players. I suppose actually M80 is a bad example because they're literally the example in the second solution. So let's say it's Moist Moguls, right? Ludwig gets in a room with the Guard. And Ludwig says, I'm willing to pay you money to decline the TPA. And then I'm going to pick up the players from the Guard. And the Guard says, well, okay, we were thinking of getting out of esports anyway. So, yeah, all right then. We have a buyout. You'll need to pay the buyout fee plus some extra money. And yeah, we'll let you keep the players. We'll let you have the slot and the players. But the reason that this doesn't make sense to me is that the slot is not for sale. And Riot have the final say in who takes over the sale of the, a roster acquisition like this. Or at least they don't have the final say. Riot don't get to pick the org, but Riot have to approve or deny. So one of the ways that this could happen, and one of the ways that Riot would be scared that it would happen is, Ludwig is in a room with the guard, and Ludwig says, okay, we've got a handshake agreement, all right. And nobody tells Riot about this. The guard declined the TPA, and Riot goes to the guard and says, what the fuck, dude? Why didn't you sign the TPA? And they go, we just don't want to. And then Riot goes, okay, well, we need to find these players a new home and treat them like free agents. And the players are like, yeah, well, we have already been in discussion with Moist Moguls, and we want to get picked up by Moist Moguls. At that point, if Riot approve that, if they don't know that a lot of money changed hands behind closed doors, then that does open the door for slots to be sold. You see how the fact that the guard players are not free agents does create this scenario that Riot are worried about. So the key distinction being, Riot being worried about this statement is valid if the players are not free agents. And that is going to happen in a lot of situations. That is going to happen if Riot denies the TPA for one of the teams. Like Riot declines them entering Ascension. So let's say it's, like Tate Esports. The players are still going to be under contract. Hard to treat them as free agents because it's very easy for Tate Esports to sell the slot, which they don't want. That's also going to happen in a situation like this where an organization declines the TPA but still has their players under contract. How do you get around that? I'm not exactly sure. I think the problem is you can't really so here's one solution. One solution could be that you mandate teams at the end of Ascension release their players if they decline the TPA. The problem is they haven't signed anything at that point. They haven't signed the TPA to say that they abide by the rules that Riot have set. So Riot can't dictate to these teams until they sign the TPA. And if they decline to sign the TPA, they're not bound by the rules. So you see that Riot are in a bit of a quandary here. It's actually really difficult for them to make a good decision by the players and by the system. Like, it's difficult for them to make something that's in the spirit of the system work if these organizations keep their players under contract and decline the TPA or get refused into partnership. So it makes a really big difference. And that is the major issue that I didn't realize when we were recording the Platchat episode, is that the guard players were under contract. They were not free agents at the time. However, if these free agent teams, as discussed up here, are just essentially going to have a bidding system, you're selling the fucking slots anyway. You're selling them every time a free agent team joins the league. So why not sell them here as well? Yes, it means that some organizations are going to win Ascension with the idea of not signing the TPA and selling. But I think that's better than creating a scenario where you have to occasionally decline to promote a team entirely. I think it's better to have orgs occasionally sell their spot, which you're already doing anyway if there's a free agent team. You're already offering the spot to the highest bidder. It's just that the money goes to the players. I think it's better that than creating scenarios whenever an unethical org or an org that isn't interested wins Ascension and you just don't promote anybody. So it is more complex than you might think. However, I think they could simplify it and it would be fine. They just need to not be so bothered about this. So, let's move on to the second proposal. Right? Let's move on to the second proposal. The second solution was that you promote the runner-up, M80. And they were worried about that for questionable precedents. They said that the point of Ascension is to reward performance, and as great and talented as M80 is, qualifying a team that didn't win the tournament defeats the purpose. Promotion is earned in-game, not out of it. I hate this sentence because all of the partnership teams got their spots because of what they do outside of the game. EG were shit last year. They didn't get their partnership spot because their team was excellent. Optic failed to get a partnership spot despite being the best team of the pre-partnership era. So qualification into the partnership system has never been to do with your in-game performance. So let's not pretend that it ever was. Maybe it is now with the Ascension system, but this is a pointless line to draw in the sand when it's never been an issue in the past. However, there are real reasons why you wouldn't want M80 to be promoted. First of all, it's unsatisfying from an idealistic point of view. You want the team that earned their spot to at least have a chance of being represented. I talked about earlier the fact that the Guard may well have not even been playing for the Guard if the organization ascended because of economic reasons, but at least a couple of them would, and there'd be some kind of through connection. But from an idealistic point of view, it's not as satisfying as treating the treating the roster as a free agent team. However, there is another logistical reason why you wouldn't want the Guard to be promoted. And it again comes down to the transfer of money. Because if you do set the precedent that the second place team always gets in if the first gets declined or, more importantly, doesn't sign the TPA, that means that M80 themselves could pay money to the Guard, telling them not to sign the TPA and knowing they are guaranteed to get the spot. It's not the case that they need to, participate in some bidding war. It's not the case that they need to be selected by Riot in a lottery or whatever the fuck other kind of system. They would know if your precedent was, we always promote the runner-up. If that was your rule, that's your protocol. M80 would be incentivized to try to pay the Guard to not sign the TPA because they know that it would be them next up. And that, I think, is a larger issue, in my opinion, in terms of slots being sold in the VCT, because there's a direct financial incentive there for the second place teams to try to pay their way in, rather than the first place team looking to get out and wanting to grab a quick buck on the way out, right? You already want... So with the option we talked about earlier, where the team that wins Ascension is looking to leave esports or leave Valorant and just gets a quick buck on the way out, I'm not bothered about that because they were already intending on leaving. They probably weren't going to be a good partner anyway. But this situation where the second place team has a financial incentive to try to pay the first place team to not sign the TPA, I think that has many more ethical issues and is an unhealthy situation to breed within your system. You could also extend the logic to the extreme here as well. For example, your team qualifies to Ascension and your roster bundles the money together and pays the organization fat cash to drop you all as free agents. So whenever the deadline is, or even after you've already won Ascension or something, they drop you. So you're participating in Ascension and you're winning Ascension as a free agent team, but you've been earning salary all year by a certain organization and you've paid the org to drop you. You inherit the spot and you've been asked by Riot, you have 2 months to find a new organization, and you demand extremely large salaries and force a bidding war because the org that pays you the most is going to get that spot, and they really want the spot because it's good for them, good for their growth. They get digital goods rights, etc., etc. You make a profit because you were able to push your salary up a lot, even though you had to pay the org to get to drop you. However, I think this system is very unrealistic because it's extremely risky in terms of getting a return on your payment. It's so obviously against the terms of service of how they want the system to operate. So if you ever got caught doing it, you would get mega fucked. And I think that's much more important for players because player careers, I mean, that is just everything for them, whereas an organization tends to be a corporate entity that can't be punished in the same kind of way. It's not all in on a certain game. It has people behind it that have other options if the org tanks. It's not their entire livelihood in the same way that a player is. So it's just way too risky for them, way too obviously against how Riot would want things, way too obviously punishable. And it's unlikely, based on players having that amount of, frankly, like cash to spend to buy the org off, and having to group up to enact a situation like that. Especially when they also need to negotiate their severance pay so that if they got their salaries dumped immediately upon making partnerships, they wouldn't lose everything that they tried to make profit out of in the future. So while the logic could be extended to not want free agent teams to work in that way, I just think the situation's so unlikely it doesn't make sense. So I tried to be very thorough there. And I fear that by being thorough, I've also ended up rambling a lot about various different possible situations. But in summary, I originally advocated very heavily for the Guard to be treated as a classic free agent roster. However, having now come to the knowledge that the Guard players were not free agents at the TPA signing deadline, I think my perspective has changed. I think Riot were put in a very difficult position where it was actually quite tough for them to consider that roster as free agents at the time because they weren't, and the Guard was going to end up getting paid there. They were going to end up having a quasi spot being sold scenario. And I think they've got a really difficult decision on their hands. Hopefully, Leo put out a follow-up tweet where he said, thanks to the community for advocating on behalf of the players so heavily. He said, I appreciate the passion with which you all showed up to advocate on behalf of the players. We hear you. There are still significant risks our team needs to dig into, but we're working through this and hope to find a positive outcome for the players. We'll update you all when we know more. I appreciate the fact that Riot do take on community response like this. I also think that they were put in a tougher spot than most people understand because the Guard players were not free agents. They were still under contract to the Guard at the time the TPA expired, or rather the time where you needed to get a signature onto the TPA. But now that they are free agents, I think you can probably resolve this in a positive outcome. Now that all of the players are free agents as of the 1st of September, I think you can get this positive outcome that people are looking for. However, even if this first option happens for the Guard, that's not really a precedent, is it? Because it doesn't tell us anything about how Riot is going to deal with the situation when players are under contract. And I fear that that always is going to be a difficult situation for Riot to deal with, because they can't force the orgs to drop their players, and they can't force, or they shouldn't force, other organizations that come into partnership to pick up certain players. Like if they forced M80 to pick up the Guard players, something like that. So even if the Guard ends up having their positive outcome for this situation, I think there are still serious questions to be asked about what happens if a team declines to sign the TPA with their players under contract again, and what happens if Riot declines an organization participation in partnerships, and they have players under contract at that point too. I don't have great answers to that situation. I think that's a very difficult one to solve. I think promoting the second place team in those kind of situations is probably the best. There's one thing that I feel fairly confident in, though, and it's that promoting no team should never be an option. There is nothing that breaks trust in the system faster. There's nothing that pisses off the community and players faster. There's nothing that makes people feel like tuning into it is a waste of their time from a viewership perspective faster. So whatever the scenario is, whatever the solution is, both in this situation and in the future, if this happens again with players who are under contract at a point at which the TPA must be signed, and it's not. Whatever the solution, I hope it's not that we just don't promote a team.